Exactly 100 years ago, soldiers, the ones that were still alive, picked themselves up out of the mud and came home. The war to end all wars was brought to a close at 5 o'clock in the morning, but out of a sense of poetry, the armistice didn't begin for another 6 hours. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a time and date each year when the world stops and remembers. Remembers more than 10 million soldiers who lost their lives. Remembers 10 million families torn apart. But less well remembered are the 140,000 Chinese workers who, in the latter part of the war, were the backbone of the British Army, digging trenches, building docks, laying tracks, repairing tanks. For them, no memorials, no roll call of names. In the aftermath of the war, as empires toppled, German, Romanov, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, China paid a heavy price for its involvement in the Great War, a price it didn't intend paying, and certainly didn't feel it deserved. So what was that price? And how has the Great War helped build China, the China that we see today? And moving it on, could it all happen again? You'd hope the world was a safer place now 100 years on, but with Trump heralding protectionism, Syria and Yemen in flames, Russia needling at the West needling at Russia, Macron talking only today of raising a European army, Britain going it alone, and at least 5 states stacked high with nuclear weapons. You'd be forgiven for thinking we'd learned nothing. Welcome to The Point. I'm Jeff Moody, sitting in for Liu Xin. Joining me here in Beijing is Qinduo, a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institute. Welcome to the programme. I've always looked at World War I and thought of World War I as primarily British troops and German troops slugging it out in the mud in France. I didn't know anything about the involvement of Chinese. Tell me their story.
Well, the Chinese laborers mostly at that time, 140,000 of them, as you pointed out at the beginning of the show. At that time, China was mostly, in the simple terms, is like semi-colonized by mostly Western powers like Britain, France, Germany, and other countries at the time. So the central government at that time was actually agreeing to send some of the Chinese laborers to help the British side and the French side, thinking probably they will be allied, will be on the side with the Britain, and will be on the winning side. And
but they didn't come into the war till quite late, did they? It wasn't till 1917 that they came across. Why so late? Because they must have seen what was happening. They must have read newspaper reports and seen the mass slaughter going on in France.
Absolutely, you have a point. They think that, the situation, if they join the British side, and they will be on the victor side, and then probably they will be able to have a say. They will be able to sit in front of the table for negotiation at the end of the war. So China somehow can protect its interests through the process.
So they joined the war on the behest of the Chinese government at the time, because they felt that if they helped the winning side, there would be something for them at the end of the process.
Yes, if you look at the number 140,000, actually half of them came from Shandong province, a coastal province on the eastern part of China, and that's where also the city of Qinduo is located. And why half of them came from Shandong? Because the British Empire has a colony in Weihai, which is a small place in Shandong. They started to recruit the Chinese laborers over there. So poor villagers from Shandong province, from neighboring province like Hebei, they joined the troops over there and shipped to Canada, from Canada to Europe, some of them direct to Europe. Because Shandong was a colony of Germany, the Chinese government thinking that if they were on the winning side, and then they may negotiate, they may ask for the return of Shandong province and also the Qingdao city.
So in effect they sacrificed the lives or the safety of these people in order to get something for the country. I mean, that's what all countries were doing at that time, weren't they? It's certainly not just a Chinese thing. That was going on across the board. Did they get what they asked for? Did they get the result?
No, that's the key point. And you know, when they asked for the return of Shandong, administration of this province, and also Qinduo city, you remember also Shandong was the birthplace of Confucius. China was practicing Confucianism, so that's very important, a critical province to the Chinese culture, to China as a country, or to the Chinese as a nation over there. But their request was basically ignored by the British, by the French over there, and then instead they turned the administration of Shandong to Japan at that time. So that outraged the Chinese back at home in Beijing, Shanghai, and other places, and even the liberals.
Which gave Japan a foothold in mainland China.
That's right. That's right. Because at the end of the war, you know, Japan declared a war against Germany, and Japan was also on the weaker side. But Japan was a stronger power at the time. Obviously, sitting at the table, you know, I think the seats given to the Chinese delegates actually 2 seats fewer than those for Japan at that time. And the Chinese foreign minister, you know, received a letter from one of the liberals, basically a letter with a knife, saying that if you sign up to the Versailles Treaty, basically giving up the rights of Shandong, now you don't need to go back to China. Probably you can kill yourself with this knife.
Gosh. So was Shandong Japan's first foothold in mainland China?
Starting from Shandong, then Japan want to so-called expand its space, international space. They invaded the Korean Peninsula, and then from there they invaded, eastern part of Shandong. They started the war against Russia, so-called Japan-Russia war, and they occupied, that eastern part, the northeastern part of China, and then they moved, from all kinds of incidents. Some say it's it's like a planned instant, and then they started the war, against Beijing, basically occupied Beijing, then moved all along to the southern China.
Exactly, and ultimately, then you have
20 years
Nanjing
later,
and Shanghai.
10 years later, 1930s.
Yes,
yeah.
and all the rest of it, just like what happened in Germany, where the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles led to so many consequences and ultimately led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. It's been argued, hasn't it, that the student-led protest in Beijing, the May 4th movement, which ultimately led to the establishment of socialism in China back in 1921 and the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. It's been argued that this May 4th movement was organized in response to that anger in the country about how China, in China's words, had been stitched up in the peace process.
But I would say that's you can say so in a sense, because that's a direct cause of the May 4th movement. When the news came back to China, people heard that even China was on the winning side. Shandong was not given back to China. Instead, it was given to the Japanese. So people were outraged, and they expressed their anger at the government, to the foreign ministry, to the foreign minister and other delegates over there. So that's the May 4th movement, of course, with along with the Chinese liberals, also the educated young Chinese people working as translators. They saw the West. They learned some of the new idea. When they came back to China, there is import of the new ideology, that's communism. That's why 2 years later, you have 1921, you have the Communist Party was established. So people see, we need a new path to establish China, as a country which will deserve some respect in the international community. All the old practice, old system, old regime will be gone. It's not working.
A sentiment that was followed on in so many places, in Russia, in Germany, Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and all the rest of them, the Ottomans. But for now, Xu Qingduo, thank you very much indeed.
Sure.
Well, let's take a quick break, but when we come back, it all seems so long ago, grainy images of a conflict long gone. But 20 years after the end of the war to end all wars, the world was at it again. When we look back at the wars of the 20th century, are we seeing history, or are we looking to our future? Could there ever be another world war? And what would it look like? And just how close are we? I'll be putting these questions to a panel of experts from around the globe in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back. The Chinese have a very different way of looking at the future compared to us Westerners. They see the future as behind them and the past in front. Because you can't see the future, it's hidden, it's behind us. But the past is laid out in front for all to see. Is the past behind us, or is it in front of us? This might just be semantics, and perhaps it is, but it does raise an interesting point or two. When we look at the past, are we really looking at the future? After all, as the old saying goes, if you don't remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it. So is 2018 all that different from 1914, when old alliances, ancient grudges and familiar fears were lining up like dominoes, one push and they all come tumbling down? Well, here to discuss this, I'm joined again from Beijing by Qinduo, a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution, from Rome by Francesco Sishi, a senior researcher at the Center for European Studies at Renmin University, from Washington, D.C. by Richard Weitz, a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, and from our Moscow studio by Pavel Felgenhauer, political columnist with Novaya Gazeta. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. We've got a vast team here today, so I'll try and get as many questions into you as I can. Can we start with Francesco Sishi, if I may? The French President Emmanuel Macron gave a speech today in which he warned about the dangers of nationalism. He warned about the dangers of a rising tide of populism in the United States. President Trump was listening into this speech as well. What did you make of it? He talked about the growing ancient demons that caused World War I and are still there today. Do you think those demons are still there today?
Well, this is the sense we have in Europe. In a way, we are really back, we feel we are back 100 years ago. There is nationalism spreading all over the continent. In many countries, in France, of course, we have neo-nationalist movements, in Italy, in Germany, everywhere. So there is a sense of new danger coming up. And I think it is a reaction in historical differences to the globalization. In a way, the globalization process was going very far, going very fast in the past 2-3 decades, as the globalization process was going on at the end of the 19th century. In a way, colonialism was the first wave of globalization then. So I think it is a risky time. It is indeed a risky time.
Richard Weiss, Macron is saying, isn't he, that protectionism can lead to war. Mistrust, selfishness, putting your own country first, America first, ideas and policies like that is bad for world peace. But it wasn't actually protectionism that led to World War I, was it? At the end of the day, it was the opposite. It was a version of multilateralism, because there was one event, the death of Archduke Ferdinand, and then the domino effect happened. Alliances came together with alliances, and all of these other countries had to join in the war, even though they didn't have a vested interest in it. They had to join in because of multilateralism, because they'd all come together in these pacts.
Right. The historians, of course, are still disputing the causes of World War I, but they've raised a series of I think, plausible hypotheses. One of them, as you mentioned, they don't describe it as multilateralism. They describe it as the alliance structure at the time. The original thinking was the alliances were so solid that once one country went to war, all the others had to follow. But studies since then have shown that a major problem was that the alliances were fragile, and so a country like Russia felt it had to intervene on Austria-Hungary's side or it would risk losing the alliance in the future. And that's a similar problem to today, but there are a lot of differences. I mean, the economic integration was a different kind of integration. I mean, it's far more than trade today that matters. We have much more foreign investment, much more global production. The nationalism then was different from from now. The nationalism then was to try and expand your empire, seize territories. Now the nationalism is mostly just keep out the foreigners. And there are other similarities and differences you can go down the line. So certainly we need to be cautious about ending up in a World War I type global conflict through the same causes. But there's just many differences, and above all, I would think nuclear weapons that have a restraining effect on conflict.
We'll come on to nuclear weapons in a minute, but Francesco Sishi, we were hearing there from Richard Weitz. He was saying that it's all about how strong these alliances are, and perhaps in the First World War they weren't as strong as they should have been. The EU is the ultimate example of an alliance of nations, and it was built in 1948 partly as a way of trading, primarily as a way of trading, but it was also there to protect the security of Europe, so that everyone would come together, so that there would never again be a war in Europe. What if one of the EU countries is attacked by an outsider? Is it automatically guaranteed that all of the other countries within Europe come to the aid of the country that's been attacked?
Well, this would be NATO. And of course, one of the problems then and now, although there are, of course, differences, but now what is striking are the similarities, is that then the system of alliances came crumbling down, and so is the system, the political system now also being eroded day by day. NATO is not as it was before. The EU, which was the backbone of security and development in Europe since the end of World War II and after the end of the Cold War, is also changing shape. I mean, there are growing conflicts between different member states. There is a growing dispute between countries which want to go on with the system as it is, and some which are raising the issue of changing the system, modernizing the system, and overall there is the lack of leadership. In a way, this EU system was the brainchild of United States, and also United States helped fostering this European Union. But now, apparently, the United States is distracted, is not very interested in the fate of Europe. It is not clear whether it is backing or not backing the Brexit, which would be a blow to the unity.
Let me put that point to Richard Weitz here, briefly.
Okay,
you don't care anymore about Europe, is that right, Richard? The Americans don't care about what happens in Europe? That's what you've just heard.
Well, I think that the policies of governments, including the current one, have been to reaffirm the NATO alliance, and you've seen this with, I think, if anything, the U.S. commitments under NATO and the amount of spending on NATO has increased in the last 2 years. EU, it's always been a bit ambiguous, but we haven't seen any anti-EU effort to try and break up the structure. It's more trying to work with them through NATO, but disagree on trade measures. Now, it's true that the current president's rhetoric sometimes gives the impression that he's all done with foreign ties and so on, but he's backed off from that since the campaign. And I think if you look at the actual policies of the administration, there's a lot of continuity with previous ones.
Pavel Felgenhauer, from the various steps taken by the West and NATO, the extension of NATO to the borders of Russia, the establishment of the missile defense system in Romania and Poland, the termination of the ABM, and now this whole business with the INF Treaty, and goodness knows what's going to happen with that at the moment. Analysts have been arguing, haven't they, that the Russian leadership has clearly come to the conclusion that a major war cannot be ruled out. Do you think it can be ruled out? A major World War III?
Well, there's a standing assessment by the Russian military, by the general staff, there's a document called the Plan of Defense of the Russian Federation, and the threat assessment associated with it, as described by Russian military and security chiefs, is that the threat of war is growing. It's going to grow through the 20s and up to 30, and there's a possibility of large regional wars and maybe even a global war. So yes, the threat is there. The Russian military and the Russian state are preparing for the threat, but it's still seen as a possibility, a probability. It's not kind of ironclad, and I hope that it won't happen. Many hope that it won't happen. The INF Treaty most likely is going to go, but there won't be an immediate arms race because the United States, which wants to leave the treaty, does not have the weapons it could have deployed if the treaty is gone, so at least not in the coming several years. So, and of course there's also nuclear deterrence that helped keep the peace since 45. I mean, there was no World War. But, and so most likely there will be proxy wars. There were proxy wars. There are proxy wars happening in different parts of the globe. But a global war still seems rather remote. No one really wants it, and I hope it won't happen. But the probability of such a thing escalating, of a conflict escalating out of control, as did the First World War, of staffs going on schedule and troops beginning to move and it becomes unstoppable, that threat does exist.
But Pavel, what would it actually look like? Because of course in the First World War it was trench warfare and then the introduction of planes. Second World War it was tanks, it was travelling across the globe, it was the Air Force, it was the Navy. A Third World War won't look like that, will it? A Third World War will be a tech war, primarily, surely. What do you think, Pavel?
Well, again, no one knows for sure what it's going to be like, and some the military people tend to be conservative, and they're still building tanks and deploying tank divisions and motorized infantry and ships and planes, most likely believing that this old stuff is going to work. Though maybe it's going to be more in the cyberspace and robots fighting each other. Again, right before it actually happens, it's impossible to fully comprehend those the beliefs on what First World War would look like before it happened were actually nothing to what really happened. And the same with the Second World War. Again, staffs were planning and specialists for one thing, and a totally different one happened. So right now it's impossible to say for sure.
It is, but I've just read Hillary Clinton's latest book, What Happened, and in that book she accuses the Russians of launching a cyber war on the United States. Do you think that's a fair enough point?
Well, that's what's being accused. The Russians say that it's far-fetched and that the Americans are doing more cyber warfare and actually have more capabilities. And what we know from people like Snowden, what the American cyber warfare capabilities are, most likely they are much more advanced than the Russian ones. And Russia would be saying that we're actually on the defensive side. But Russia always says it's on the defensive side. Actually, everyone says that they're defending and the other side is attacking. But again, in the cyber part of it, it's very hard to really figure out who's attacking and who's defending.
Yeah, you may well be right. Qinduo, Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, who's been in China this week, he's talked in depth about a trade war and what that might mean. He's been saying recently that there is a risk of it getting out of control, like in Europe in 1914. He's actually said this, so that both countries have to realize that conflict between them would destroy hopes for the world order. So he's spelling out here that a cyber war is one thing, but a trade war can escalate into a major world war. Do you think that's fair?
Well, a trade war itself is not something to fear.
But can it escalate, though?
That's the point. That is the point. You know, we are already seeing this spillover effects into other areas. For example, for its geopolitical area, like the U.S. Challenging China, you know, supporting Taiwan in the South China Sea issue, and also some U.S. academic institutions, universities are severing ties with their Chinese partners. Things like this can help, can lead to, I would say, you know, escalation of tension, and also the cornerstone of people-to-people relationship that could be damaged. I think that's really worrisome, long-term point of view. Yeah.
What do you think we need to do now? This is for Francesco Sishi. What do you think the world needs to do now to make the threat of nuclear war less intense for us?
Well, nuclear war is very technical. There should be some kind of agreement for greater enforcement of spread of nuclear technology, and growing the escalation of nuclear arsenals. But I don't see this happening so far, because the tension, as you mentioned and as the other guests mentioned, is growing. So I think the key issue here is to try to talk really about the problems here, and facing the problems. There are actual real problems. It's not just fears. There is a growing conflict about the byproducts of globalization. Globalization started in the 90s under some premises that everybody would trade in the same way, and now this has not happened, and there are growing disagreements and expectations, different expectations in different countries. These issues should have been addressed, I think, squarely and honestly. If we keep on beating around the bush, unfortunately, these disagreements and these misunderstandings will grow even bigger and more difficult to address. Okay,
thank you very much indeed for that. Just last word, if I may, to Qinduo. Would there ever be an occasion, do you think, very, very briefly, that China would come to the aid of one of its allies that needed military help?
I don't think so. I don't think it's likely China will ever do that right now.
Okay. That was a brief answer. I asked for a brief answer and I got one. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Qinduo, Senior Researcher at the Pangoal Institution, Francesco Sishi, a Senior Researcher at the Centre for European Studies at Renmin University, Richard Weitz, who's there, the Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and finally Pavel Felgenhauer, political columnist with Novaya Gazeta. Thank you all, gentlemen, for that discussion. Well, that's it from me for this edition of The Point. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle ThePointWithLX. Download the application, it's called CGTN, and you can watch our show there on your mobile devices if you want to see this again. Or you can go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching, as ever. Bye-bye. Thank you for your company.